Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. For me, I learnt this most vividly when I volunteered to go with my old church's youth group to a summer Christian festival called Soul Survivor as a sort of youth worker volunteer to make sure the kids behaved themselves. So one evening after the main meeting, there were these evening venues where there was entertainment going on. So I went along with 3 or 4 of the young people, but little did I know that I was going to be the entertainment. The first thing that on the agenda for the evening was we were asked volunteers from the youth workers, which I was instantly promoted to by the 3 or 4 young people I was with. And what then happened was that the unlucky people who were chosen had to do challenges. So we were up on the stage, and there were 3 of us unlucky people, and we had to pass a piece of string through our T-shirt, sort of through one armhole under the T-shirt and out the other side, which seems fine. You're just sort of standing there like this, linked to another couple of people to start off with. But then we saw what was attached to the string: a mackerel, a fish. A wet, slimy fish was then passed along through the insides of our T-shirts against our bare skin and out the other side as a kind of some sort of weird entertainment for the young people. And we now stank. And for all of us, serving can seem so glamorous at times, can't it? You know, the idea of serving in the government or in the armed forces or the emergency services, there's a faint sense of heroism and awe and pride. And then there's having wet fish put against your skin. In this passage, Jesus tells his disciples that to serve, to really serve, means giving up their freedom, giving up their rights, giving up their agendas in order to truly become servants of God. It appears that in Jesus' book, serving is far from glamorous. And as we continue our sermon series this term, we're thinking about what it means to follow Jesus. I love that we're starting with this subject. Our title this morning, you might have seen on the term card, is First Serve. And before we start going into anything deeper in discipleship, it's so important, isn't it, that we come before God and position ourselves as his servants. We come willing to serve. Otherwise, our discipleship, our walk with Jesus, is always going to be at risk of becoming about us. Becoming about how we can use our gifts, how we can serve him, but to fulfill maybe our agenda. And the only way we're going to go far with Jesus is if we keep coming back to this sense of hearing his call to become servants, just as he was a servant, to follow Jesus, the servant. Before all else, we serve. And so this morning, 3 things to think about. How do the Gentiles do it? We hear that in the verse, don't we? The Gentiles, they lord it over each other. So how do we not do it? Secondly, what does service look like in the kingdom? And third, why bother? Why bother with service? So how not to do it? And the main point here is that if you truly want to serve, don't bring your own agenda. Seek someone else's. If you really want to serve, submit to someone else's agenda. Verse 25, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Jesus says to the disciples, don't be like the rulers and the officials you see around you in the world who try and impose their agenda on other people, who love power because they love getting their own way. And what's interesting is that we've already seen a little bit of an attempt at that in the passage, haven't we? In verse 20, we read, then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus with her sons. That's James and John, who were 2 of Jesus' closest disciples. So this is already a little bit bizarre, isn't it? Why is mum here? What is going on? I think if I was Jesus or an onlooker, I'd be raising my eyebrows a bit. I imagine this is potentially how teachers feel if after school one day they see a parent coming towards them with the child in tow. You're beginning to think, they want to chat, what's going on? And then, coming to Jesus, they kneel down. Okay, now really what is going on? You come with your sons, now you're kneeling down, and they asked a favor of him. I now see what's going on. And Jesus says, what do you want? And this whole scene reminds me terribly of moments in family life when I say to my wonderful wife, Sarah, you know I really love you. You know I'd do anything for you. Well, could I possibly by, could I possibly go out to this thing or that thing? Or even worse, could you possibly empty the dishwasher, or could you take the bins? I know you're all shocked to hear that that happens, but we all know it does, don't we? And if you claim that it never happens, you're lying. We've all been in the position of James and John and their mother. We've all come to Jesus, appeared to have knelt down reverently and said, Lord, I'll follow you, I'll go wherever you call me, I'll do whatever you want to do. I just have one condition. I just want to live in a big house. I just want to make sure I can go on holidays each year. I just want to make sure I can still have this job or that I can get this promotion. The point is we can all bring our agendas, can't we? It's so easy. I've done it. We come to serve God, and then just like the rulers and high officials who use their authority over people to bring their agenda, we suddenly find that we're beginning to push our agenda. Just like James and John, they were some of Jesus' closest disciples. They had almost that position. But Jesus says, don't use it to force your own agenda. When we really want to serve in life, in church, at work, at home, we must be prepared to lay that down. Lay down our preferences, accept that things might not always be done the way we'd ideally like them to be done. There will be a time and place to seek how the Lord might be calling each of us to use our gifts, and that's part of what we're doing at the moment. Lord, what are you saying to me? How do I use the gifts, the talents, the personality you've given me to serve you? But if we come to serve, we must be answerable to someone else. Otherwise, we may be seeking to use our own gifts for our own good. If we come seeking to use them for someone else's vision, ideas, or agenda, that's the safeguard. That's how we know we're really seeking to serve. And that's so important. I've heard so many Christian speakers warn young, enthusiastic Christians of the dangers of the stage or the platform if they want to be a speaker or they want to be a worship leader. But also their encouragement that if you want to do that, the way to start is with the one person in front of you. It's in the secret place. It's when no one's watching. It's doing it just for God, to serve. And then, if you can be trusted with that, if you end up doing it with thousands in front of you, it won't make any difference to you. Because at the end of the day, even if we're in leadership and seemingly have no one who's visibly above us, kind of in the authority structure or whatever, even if we have a ministry with our name on it, if we're serving, if we really understand what it means to serve, we'll be seeking after the Lord's agenda. So how does service work in the kingdom? Whoever wants to be great must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. It's the upside-down kingdom. What's best in the kingdom? What's greatest? Laying down our lives for the sake of others. Because servants or slaves don't get to choose what they do they? That's up to the master. A servant or a slave doesn't get to pick the hours they work necessarily, or the jobs they do, or when or where they do things. Instead, they give up everything in order to serve their masters. And that is something that our society is totally at odds with, isn't it? We are not used to answering to someone else's agenda. We've become so suspicious of those in power, or we've been sucked into the lie that it's all about us, that we can choose to do whatever we want, or go wherever we want, do whatever we want. And yet the pressure that brings is sometimes unbearable. Some of us don't really know what we want to do, or when or where we want to do it. And truth be told, I quite like taking orders at times from people. If Tim tells me to do something, I'm fine with that because it's meant that he's had to make the decision. You know, one of the best things about, hopefully, one of the best things about holidays, I find, is that I don't have to make too many decisions. And there's something that's so helpful about that in some ways. But I think the biggest reason that we're so suspicious of submitting submissively to someone or to a master, finding something we can give our whole lives to, is because we've become so suspicious as a society. We've become suspicious of the institutions we once trusted in, of banks after the financial crisis, of our politicians, of the church sometimes. Maybe we've been hurt in the past. Maybe we've just seen some of the headlines in the news. And what's more, if we've been in sort of a Western academic education system, if we've been to university, we're encouraged to interrogate and question everything. And so if we don't understand why someone's asking us to do something, that can be really difficult if we don't entirely know what's going on. But what Jesus models for us is something totally different to the disciples' approach, when they maybe don't trust that following him is going to lead to the kind of remuneration that they want, or when they think that maybe they're better than all the other disciples, when they have their own agenda. And what Jesus models is his teaching. The initial response to their mother when she says, "Grant that one of my 2 sons may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." And Jesus says, "To sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." It's like he's saying, why are you asking me? I've come to serve my Father and his agenda. That's not my call. It's not my decision as to who sits in those positions. I don't call the shots. He's totally subservient to his Father. And I can almost imagine James or John saying back to him, "Oh, can't you at least put in a good word for us? Can't you somehow get our agenda on the table?" But it's not up for discussion. Jesus can't do that. He says, "I'm subservient to my Father. It's not my decision." And there's almost like there's that hint of the implication that he's saying to them, are you still on board? Are you still in? I know you don't understand this. I know I can't give you what you want, but are you still in? Do you still trust me enough to follow me even when you don't understand? And are we willing to serve God like that? It's such a tough call, isn't it? That even when God calls us to things we might not want to do, even when we don't understand something, will we trust him to keep serving him? And are we willing to serve even when there are sometimes things we disagree with or find frustrating, when we have to serve within certain constraints? Because sometimes being a servant, it involves sacrifice, doesn't it? I think many of us probably already understand this in some way. If we're parents, we'll be serving our children, and perhaps we might want to have carried on with careers, but we take that off the kind of agenda for the minute so we can serve our children. We live within constraints. Or if we're teaching, we might have to do things like marking or inputting performance data into spreadsheets, and that might be incredibly frustrating, but we do it because we know that that's what God's called us to. Or if we're leading a life group and it comes around to the evening and we're thinking, gosh, I'm really not sure I want to do this. I'm going to have to get ready again. I'm going to have to get all the things out. But actually we do it anyway because we know that that's what God has called us to. There will be times when we do things in a certain way that we may not like because we know that that's what God is calling us to. At the church Sarah and I were at in London, I was the intern, so I did a lot of hoovering, a lot of moving chairs, a lot of the sort of menial jobs. But even when I was in that kind of environment of serving in that way, I still sometimes struggled to totally abide by the vicar's decisions if I thought I knew better. So one particular occasion when this happened was we had a giving kind of campaign over Lent. We were all given jam jars. We had to take them away, empty jam jars, and fill them up with loose change. And then on Easter Day, we brought them all back, and we had sort of 30 jam jars full of loose change, which was amazing. Quite a small church. Now, just before I began working as the intern, I'd been working at HSBC, the local bank branch, and I knew that we had this amazing machine where you could take all your loose change and it would sort it all for you. Have you seen those? I think they sometimes have them in Sainsbury's. You literally just dump all your change in and it counts it and puts it straight into your bank account. So I thought, brilliant, we can do this with the jam jars. But the vicar said, actually, I think we should count it now by hand. And I was thinking, you are nuts. Why on earth? What a muppet. Why on earth would you want to count 30 jam jars by hand after a morning service when I could take them all to HSBC and do it in 10 minutes? And so I was really frustrated, and being slightly arrogant, I sort of went off in a bit of a huff and tried to do something else I thought was holy, like the washing up. But I wish I'd had the humility to get involved and serve, and to just say, okay, it's his decision, it's his responsibility, I'm just going to do that. Because what happened next was really incredible. The people that then started counting the money, who were there for the next 20 minutes, had the most amazing time talking, getting to know each other. They were in awe of the generosity of God's people. They were amazed at God's provision for the church. There was incredible things that came out of it. I'd been in ministry as an intern for about 6 months and thought I knew better than the vicar. And don't say I still think I do. And actually, it turned out that the vicar obviously knew better and had reasons for wanting it to be counted, and would have been really helpful if I just said, okay, if I'd gone back to that servant mentality of saying, I'm just here to serve. I want to serve. I'm happy to serve however you ask me to. I'm not going to put my hands up and kind of go off in a huff. And yet with all of these examples, all of those examples of where we might have to serve within constraints, I think the thing that can make it easier for us is the fact that actually in the kingdom we're serving God, not people. We might serve people, but people are not our final master. Jesus was undoubtedly there to serve the disciples, but the disciples weren't his master. God was his master. And that is key, because if we've ever been in service, we'll know it's draining. We'll know that sometimes it can be frustrating, sometimes it can be painful. But if at the end of the day, God is our master, then we will survive. If people become our ultimate master, people can be very demanding, as we probably all know. And we will end up finding that we might get burnt out, we might get hurt. But if we're serving people with God as our master, God is the master who is a father and wants to give all that we need to serve. He's the God who will help us to flourish. If Jesus is our master, he's the master that came to serve rather than be served. He's the one that leads by example and who gave his life as a ransom for us. So we might end up serving people, but God is our ultimate master. So why do we do it? Why bother with serving? Because Jesus is a servant, and when we serve, we will find him. When I was a teenager, I used to have one of those WWJD wristbands. Did anyone have one of those? Anyone remember what it stands for? What would Jesus do? Yeah, always on my wrist to try and remind me how to respond when I was feeling angry or frustrated by something. And whenever I think of that phrase, I often think, what would Jesus be doing today? And if Jesus worked for a church, what kinds of things would he be doing? And I always think of the lowly jobs. I always think that if Jesus were here, he'd probably be cleaning the toilets, doing the hoovering, mopping up the sick that's left from the previous night outside the front door, emptying the bins, things that David, our lovely facilities coordinator, does, things that I've seen Tim do and other people in the staff team do. I imagine Jesus doing all those unpleasant jobs, kind of like foot washing was really unpleasant in Jesus' time because people didn't wear particularly sturdy shoes and their feet would be covered in dust and mud and sometimes animal excrement. And actually that really inspires me, and it makes me want to do those things because I know that when I serve in that way, I'm serving as Jesus did. I'm serving with that same servant-heartedness, and actually I then find that Jesus is there when I'm doing those things. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Serving sacrificially is what Jesus did, and it's what he calls us to do when we follow him. And I've often felt so close to God and found a deep joy when doing those humble servant things, getting the admin sorted for church events, and it's just a hassle, sorting out I-Know, our database that sometimes feels like the bane of my life, engaging with people and listening to people when I feel tired, but persevering, seeking to engage with maybe clergy colleagues in a peaceful and gracious way when sometimes I'm frustrated. When we serve, we meet Jesus, the servant. And in that place, there is a real freedom. The wonderful thing about the upside-down kingdom is when we seek to give up our lives for the sake of following Jesus, we find them. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. The church father, St. Augustine, had a famous prayer to know God. He wrote this: Lord, you are the light of the minds who know you, the life of the souls that love you, the strength of the souls who serve you. Help us to know you, that we may truly love you, so to love you, that we may fully serve you, whose service is perfect freedom. I love that sense. Whose service is perfect freedom. When we become servants of God, we meet with him, and in meeting him, we find a real freedom. And finally, I think one of the most amazing reasons why I can wholeheartedly recommend serving God is because when we do that, when we become servants of God, people see Jesus in us. And that's especially true when we are in any sort of position of leadership or authority, doing exactly the opposite of what the Gentiles do in this passage. When I was a student at Durham University at the beginning of my final year, my third year, the Bishop of Durham moved on, NT or Tom Wright. He went back onto academia and writing, and we were needing a new bishop. And we sort of heard a few months on that the Dean of Liverpool Cathedral, a guy called Justin Welby, was going to come and be the new bishop in Durham. And soon after he arrived, he visited all the sort of major cities in the diocese and planted prayer rooms in each of them. He sort of went around and set up a prayer room for a day. And I'd been very involved in prayer in the Christian Union, the students. And one evening after church on a Sunday, I came home and found a voicemail from from the Bishop of Durham saying, could we have a chat? I hear you've been involved in prayer rooms. And I was sort of astounded. I was like, this guy barely knows me. Where did he get my number? But, actually, I then rang him back. We had an hour, and he asked me, a student, he's been ordained for goodness knows how long and in ministry, and he rang and said, what have you been doing with the students? I'd like to hear about it. It was an incredible act of humility. And off the back of it, we invited him to come and speak to the Christian Union, all the students in Durham. And he agreed and was going to come. And then literally sort of 3 or 4 days before he was due to come, the then Archbishop of Canterbury asked him to go to Nigeria to do reconciliation work because there had been all kinds of violence starting between the Muslims and the Christians in Nigeria. And so he was asked to go and do some reconciliation work. And even while he was out there were bombs going off all over the place. And so his PA said, I'm really sorry, he's not going to be able to make it. The next thing I know, I look at my phone and it says Bishop Justin. I'm sort of thinking, what on earth? And I answered it, and he basically said, look, I'm really happy. I said I'd come. I'll honor the commitment. I'll write my talk on the plane on the night on the way back. I'll see my family on the Saturday morning, and then I'll come and see you Saturday afternoon. And I was astounded. I was like, you've been in Nigeria working amidst violence to try and reconcile, Muslims and Christians. You don't need to come and speak to 200 students in Durham. But the humility of saying, not kind of like, oh, I'm this big shot that's off doing this, I've been sent with this special mission over here. Just the willingness to say, yeah, I'll come. I'll speak to you about prayer. Just astounded by that humility. And I've got other stories as well. He did a carol service in someone's kitchen. They just emailed him and said, would you come and do a carol service in our kitchen? About 15 students. Yeah, okay. Just went along and did a carol service for them, preached the gospel to them. I saw something of Jesus in him. Maybe we can't relate to that, but in our old church in London, we had the most amazing couple who they were in their mid to late 50s. They sort of were retiring from work. They'd both been in finance. And they moved from their house in Chelmsford to a 2-bed masonette flat on the council estate where our church was. And they just said, we've come to serve. We'll do whatever you need doing. We don't mind whether we're doing youth work. We don't mind whether you want us to do the tax. Whatever it is you need doing, we're just here to serve. We think God's called us to come and serve. And it was just inspirational for that. And we often sort of say, we really hope we're like them when we get to that stage in life. We really hope that we've got that kind of heart for one final adventure and the humility to turn up and say, we might have been senior finance executives, but we'll do whatever. And they just spent time getting to know their neighbors and working with the young people and doing mentoring. When we serve like Jesus did, we don't only find him, we don't only find that freedom, but people see Christ in us. Oswald Chambers wrote this: the secret of a disciple's life is devotion to Jesus Christ, and the characteristic of the life is its unobtrusiveness. It's the servant-heartedness, it's the humble serving when no one's watching. He goes on, Oswald Chambers goes on, he says, it's like a corn of wheat which falls to the ground and dies, but presently it will spring up and alter the whole landscape. When people see Jesus in us, that's when we're his disciples, Christians, little Christs walking around, and that's when we see the kingdom begin to spring up in the things that we might be doing, and we begin to see the world around us changed for him. But it starts with becoming servants. First, put aside your preferences, put aside your agenda, seek your master's agenda, God's agenda, and become a servant as Christ himself came to serve. Let's pray together. Lord God, thank you that you give us the privilege to become servants with you. You have led the way for us in coming not to be served, but to serve and to give your life for a ransom for many. Lord God, would you help us to become servants with you, your hands and feet in the world? Would you work in our hearts to give us that joy of the freedom of knowing you as we serve? And in doing that, Lord, as you fill us with your Spirit, empowering us to serve, would others see you in us? The hope of glory, the hope of your kingdom, hope for the world, that you are still in love with us and beckoning us to come home to you. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.